What are boundaries, and what does it mean to set up boundaries? I've pondered that for a long time. I've never seen any clear explanation. We might say, for instance, a boundary is a communication that if you do this, you will suffer this and that consequence. We may have heard, too, that so-and-so is willing to go to the mattresses if necessary, especially if their back is against the wall, or they're willing to do what it takes to protect their family, especially their wife and children. Hence even the phrase by some, "Oh, I had to steal or do this or that to put food on the table," or we would all have starved to death, including the wife and children. And yes, the comment, it was done in self-defense. Well, according to some people and not others. But what if one is seemingly powerless? One is, say, a minority. One is, say, a female often at time. One has maybe a criminal record as registered anyway with certain record-keeping individuals. One has some other dirt on the person. Or one is physically frail. Or one figures, well, you can't fight City Hall, so what am I to do? I have no power. I think these are all legitimate concerns and often voiced and felt. I have, for instance, a book I haven't really taken a look at yet. The title is Coercive Control. And isn't slavery, in a sense, coercive control, or a lack of power seemingly to do much about erecting of boundaries, so to speak? In other words, you do this to me, and you are going to experience reliably this or that consequence. Consider, for instance, a police officer with no gun in the modern era in certain countries like ours, especially in a city like New York City. Do they have the power then to enforce setting of boundaries? Or would it be considered then a joke? In other words, if someone were conducting a robbery and a policeman arrived on the scene with no backup and no guns and said, "Please, please stop the robbery," how many robbers in time, when the word got out about this, would stop? Are they able thus to enforce boundaries? Isn't that then why we have laws, why we have courts, and theoretically why we have people to enforce them? Why we have a military also? Aren't they all, theoretically anyway, in the service of enforcing boundaries that many a person can't do themselves or would find very inefficient to do? And ultimately then, isn't that why, theoretically speaking, we have prisons also? To enforce boundaries. Otherwise, if things were mere a slap on the wrist and please don't do it again, would this be adequate? In fact, there is reports sometimes you might read or see of parents who cannot put boundaries on a child, and the child more and more sensing this may run amok, and it is the parent being directed by the child, sometimes in tantrum fashion or not. Some parents may be even afraid of being beat up by their children or reported to Child Protective Services. Or in the former Soviet Union, a child possibly reporting a parent to communist officials or whatever it was called there, as to certain apparatuses. Now, in certain rural parts of America, it might have been called and still called vigilante justice, or taking the law into your own hands, if no one is there, Johnny on the spot, to do it for you, and there's a legitimate problem. Hence the concept also of the Wild Wild West. Who's to do what then? And is it even called vigilante justice or what? Taking the law into your own hands if there is no law, or it isn't, quote, on your side. Couldn't you even say that while our military and every country's military seemingly is saying they're enforcing their citizens' rights and their citizens' safety, maybe some other countries consider it overhanded, so to speak, not justified, and vigilante justice or vigilante boundary setting. One person's vigilanteism is another person's law and order, perhaps. This can go, of course, for parents and children. Whereas the line, for instance, between corporal punishment and what they call abuse, physical abuse or whatnot. You could say some administration of corporal punishment, if not most of it, could be termed by some people, including some children, to be vigilante justice, or taking the law into your own hands. So when you consider political parties, for instance, one party may like to collect a lot of guns, especially individuals in general in rural areas compared to urban areas. The notion being that the more guns you have, the more someone else might think you could possibly use them as a countermeasure, shall we call it a boundary setting measure. And it being kind of a figurative sense then that if someone knows you have 50 guns instead of one, or some of them may be Uzis or M16s or whatnot, someone else may figure, well, anyone with that many guns has thought this through and is nobody's fool as per how they interpret their safety and what they want to defend. And so I'm going to look elsewhere for the low-hangingest fruit to pursue what I want in life. Thus, ultimately then, the phraseology, it might have been said by President Reagan, talk softly but carry a big stick. Or maybe we ought to say, some interpret that as talk in terms of let it be known there are boundaries, softly or loudly, or medium-voiced in manner, or whatnot, and yes, have a stick to wallop someone upside the head, so to speak, if your boundaries are crossed and you are very concerned about it. Others say urging nuclear armaments when someone else has them, especially, lest you have nothing to enforce a boundary and they do. You might say otherwise, it's kind of like unilateral disarmament. How are you going to enforce your boundaries, your desires, what you most find dear? Are some people thus going to walk all over you? Are you counting then on everybody being a kind, loving person who never displaces their frustrations, and on others who are non-empowered and others who basically have addictions to service, getting their fixes met, so to speak? For there are videos on people who, in order to get fixes, may steal from their mother's purse or from the church bazaar fund. Low-hanging fruit again. If that purse or bazaar fund were guarded with prickly substances or guns, we might think twice. Indeed, if you're RVing, nobody knows, for instance, if you have a gun in your RV, that's a deterrent from two-legged creatures, so to speak. It's been said that 50% of people who RV have a gun. So that's being a deterrent then. I knew a man once. He spent 5 years in a prison in eastern part of the United States for armed robbery. And he told me that amongst other things in life, what he had done once is blow up a police car with a pipe bomb. You might think, too, that type of individual is going to look a certain way in general. They're going to perhaps drive pickup trucks and ones with loud mufflers, or motorcycles, and travel in packs sometimes. They're going to let it be known with facial hair, sometimes overweightedness, that They're the type of person who would go to the mattresses and act on their own behalf, etc., etc., or send someone else to do their dealings for them. And again, who's to say what is vigilante justice versus legal justice? What's self-defense justified versus not? It depends on your frame of reference, I believe, completely. For, in fact, one person's defense mechanisms or drugs of choice or getting of fixes may appear quite normal, commonplace, and necessary, and some others say, well, that's really overhanded. Another person I knew once, an officer, was having trouble with his commanding officer, and he told me, for what it's worth, that he cornered that officer, a captain, and told the captain, if you ever mess with me again, and we're on the battlefield or whatnot, I will basically throw a hand grenade in your tent or otherwise frag you, and that will be the end of you. He told me that captain never bugged him again. Also, I believe from slavery days in the chattel sense in America, it was perhaps Frederick Douglass, the champion for slavery, who once beat up his slaveholder and never had a problem again after that. Not that I'm advocating any one course here for enforcement of boundaries, depending on what not tools are available. I'm simply stating it. On the female side, their force of power might be to threaten a sex charge. I understand from a video, Mr. Trump has had over 20 sex charges lodged against him. I would just leave it at that. Also, once 4 Duke University students were at a party, and when a stripper of their choice did not come but someone different, according to some sources, they made some slurs, so to speak, verbally to the person, and the person struck back with a sex charge that tied these men up in court for quite a long time and arguably ruined their career and their health, probably, and longevity, physically speaking. Others, too, say a parent who had not raised their child ideally might be afraid of blowback from the child once the child reaches maturity and file a charge that the child is crazy in a boundary-setting attempt before the child comes out with a memoir or accusation to public officials or maybe their boss. And they lose their reputation, their job, who knows what. They figure, well, it's me or them. And again, talking about nuclear armaments and so on, we've heard the phrase by some that a strong military is very important. Alternatively, if you don't have a strong military, perhaps sometimes the case in the Vietnam War, on the side opposite than us, say, guerrilla warfare was constantly going on, as a weapon other than the conventional sword. Hence a weapon of fear, especially concerning losses suddenly in a populace group that values very much predictability. So unpredictability and force were used as a weapon in this case, not just weapons in general. The weapon of unpredictable force, unpredictable happiness inflicted. Now, if one doesn't have physical force, one doesn't have legal force, one doesn't have law force, one doesn't have weapon force, what is one to do? Well, it seems to me oftentimes what plays out here then is, and I see this in political circles too, that emotional warfare is used instead of physical force, so to speak. Or maybe the attempt to protect yourself with a flurry of laws and lawsuits even, sometimes with the use of pro bono lawyers. And so I see perhaps 2-3 ways of emotional warfare, especially when someone seems to be lacking in the other department or doesn't want to step outside of the legal structures of their country anyway, and feels impotent, kind of like trying to file a charge against City Hall, as the phrase goes. What is one to do if City Hall, as we deem it, person-wise or corporate-wise or whatnot, seemingly isn't going to budge? Well, I kind of see it play out then sometimes as the use of an emotional weapon that we might call a reality bomb, or an insult bomb that can be an incorrect version of reality foisted upon someone else. At any rate, then, the inflection of something of a thought nature and emotional nature, and hence the bifurcation here of the phrase, "Sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words will never hurt me," often not being true. The words often effecting in turn an attack on self-esteem in someone else. An attack on their reputation, though, is a different thing. We call that perhaps libel and slander in certain cases. So this attack then on self-esteem is taken very seriously by most people. In the past, a person might challenge a person to a duel, or in the present day and always, they might be willing to go to war for the, quote, recovery of their honor. In other words, for an emotional slight, an emotional attack on their self-esteem, so to speak. But I have this question then. Let's say you wanted to make an emotional attack, so to speak, a put down, or you wanted to make a countermeasure attack in the sense of telling somebody that something is the case about them and it's true, and they might collapse, so to speak, when they were somewhat trying to deny this fact about themselves. Well, I think back to military individuals and making of inspections. If an inspector, say, is inspecting for certain things, let's say for clean shoes, polished shoes, and they show up and those shoes they are wearing themselves are very dirty, well then, wouldn't it be the height of hypocrisy in a sense, I lack a better word than that right now, for someone to enforce a situation when they have the same problem themselves, or the same issue, that could be thrown right back in their face. This is even found in Christian scriptures, for instance, whereupon Jesus was urging people not to castigate someone else if you have the same problem yourself and more. The beam and mote quote from the Bible. You might say thus, don't castigate someone else's dirty shoes or emotional dirty shoes if you've got the same dirty shoes or more. Not only dirty shoes perhaps, but ones so dirty with mud that you got cleaning out a pigsty on a farm, not just muddy, even smelly. And yet you're criticizing in terms of an emotional weapon, perhaps someone else's shoes that merely have some dust or a little dirt on them. This was pointed out, I believe, thus in the Bible. Well, what are we to do then if we seemingly just don't have any strengths at all to muster, to enforce what we might call boundaries for our best welfare? And we hopefully deem that we are worthwhile to defend to some degree. Well, I think this was the case for the Indian persons of certain levels. I don't know what they would call them, the caste system-wise in India at the time of Gandhi. And as well, not just concerning Gandhi, but with Pakistanis when they were led in a smaller faction by a man named Khan, K-H-A-N. There's a book out on this by Eastwarren, Eknath Eastwarren, in this latter case. Well, Gandhi's followers and Khan's followers didn't have much in terms of weaponry or physical strength against the British in particular. And so you could say they had no physical weaponry and they weren't going to maybe use insults as a weapon. Many of them weren't of that sort. And so what weapon did they use then, of an emotional nature, you might say? I'm reminded at this point then perhaps the phrase, be so good they can't ignore you, or be so good they can't criticize you also. Even be so good, ultimately in terms of your anger level being very low, your fear level being very low, and your, shall we say, condescension or put down of others level very low, that they, quote, not only can't ignore you and ignore this, but in effect, a mirror is being held up to them, to their emotional face, which is basically a comment then that has validity, I believe, strongly, as opposed, say, to a comment made that so-and-so is putting others down when you're doing the same thing, or say the analogy again to the military, criticizing someone or writing them up or whatnot with demerits for dirty shoes when you have them yourself. What if you are so perfect, relatively speaking, in the emotional department, in this case anger and put-downs and also fear, that the other person really experiences what I would call a mirror held to their own face, because they can't come back and say, well, you're the same way. This, of course, easier said than done, by far, and a really hard row to hoe. For instance, you consider in World War II that Adolf Hitler was making more and more moves on various nations. For instance, Einstein was considering himself a pacifist, whatever that word might mean, but as time went on, he saw that this seemingly wasn't getting anywhere, and he advocated force against Hitler, the same being the case then the British against Hitler also. Why didn't it go the way then of Gandhi or Khan? Gandhi for the Indian persons and Khan for the Pakistanis. Why weren't they holding a mirror up to Mr. Hitler then, so to speak, and instead advocating and taking up arms? Well, perhaps I would surmise and more that it's because so few people can be that kind of a person, be so good in the phrase they can't ignore you or fight you in that department. The, you might say, lily-white clean emotional department. For we've heard the phrase, they can't get anything on me, so I'm powerful. Well, maybe someone, in rare instances, like with Gandhi or Khan, were of the sort that nothing could be gotten on them, typically speaking, relative to others, in terms of, again, anger and the fear level and, of course, put-downs. You might call it emotional violence. But this very hard to pull off, especially, I might say, for high intelligence people. I'll conclude with something to share. I was watching once, it might have been 5-7 years ago, a movie about Pope Francis, and the movie's title was something like Francis, a Man of His Word. I had been struggling considerably with anger issues at that point in my life, was keeping an anger journal. Interesting to say I still have it. Might be interesting to look back at it sometime. At any rate, though, I watched about half of the movie and shut it off. Why did I shut it off? I felt so much pain in me, myself, comparatively speaking to the Pope, in terms of the discrepancy in our anger and, let's say, my level of put-downs, level of insults, whatnot. Watching the Pope in action, at least portrayed in the movie, I felt so quickened with what you might call a mirror held to my face, or my virtue, so to speak, my self-esteem, that I had to shut it off. You might say thus he had a weapon upon not just me, but a lot of other people too. Isn't that then, to close, why we shudder if we hear stories of a, quote, granny of 80, 90 years of age walking down the street and then mugged, pushed to the sidewalk for $5 in her purse, and then her ending up in the hospital with broken bones or broken hip, what have you. Same going for a child. Isn't that why we sometimes find ourselves in abhorrence over what we call child abuse, or sometimes the phrase molestation? A child seemingly defenseless or not willing to go to the mattresses, so to speak, in certain manners. Maybe not able to. For is a child able to carry a baseball bat or a gun to classrooms? I don't think so. Are they able to hire a lawyer? I don't think so. Are they able very easily to say anything that might injure someone else's reputation and then garner in possible retaliation a libel and slander charge? I don't think so. Are they able even to get emancipation from parents until, say, the age of 16? I don't think so. Are they able to stop what a parent might call corporate punishment? I don't think so. And yet we do have the concept of the abhorrence of injury to a child or someone very elderly who we call as defenseless. Wouldn't the best way of defining non-defense, in this terms, the use not of physical force or emotional put-downs, but instead, if we could muster the Gandhi effect or the Khan effect and have, or even the Pope effect, as per what I experienced one evening anyway, watching Francis, A Man of His Word, if that was the exact title of the movie, wouldn't that be magnificent? I think almost nobody on the planet can pull that off, unfortunately. Isn't that what theoretically then we call a saint? Yes, isn't a saint then ultimately the person who can enforce boundaries in a manner completely different, in a manner of holding up a mirror to someone else by way of example so contrary that the other person shudders at what they see, it impacting their self-esteem? For I think most all of us would like to think we're kind, loving people on some level, at least as we define who a human being is. Some twisting this to say they can do whatever they want with no impunity to conscience because they've redefined a person as someone less than human and found some backing for that from some sources. I think ultimately, and then you might even divide these into three sources of power that mankind uses: physical power, emotional put-down power, and finally, the power of, some might call it spirituality, for lack of a better word, at least in my mind, the power of holding a mirror up to someone else and having it stick, so to speak, because the mirror holder is so different than the person they're holding the mirror up to. One final example. One time in India, someone started choking Gandhi to death, and he was so fearless and so non-reactive in the emotional put-down sense, and so non-violent also. Not that he was holding a gun or a big muscle man or whatnot. He was a very thin, frail man. That also, no blame, so to speak, that being one of the biggest mirrors, I think, that can be held up to someone else in certain circumstances, that the man stopped halfway through the choking process, took off the hands he had on Gandhi's throat, broke down and sobbed. Isn't that thus a form of what we call spiritual power, for lack of a better word? Or maybe, again, if you don't want to use the word spiritual power, it's kind of a murky word, mirror-holding power, or the person's character, the person's strengths, and what they won't do, their fearlessness also, of course. Being a mirror held up to the other person, making the other person shudder at a sudden loss of self-esteem, I believe you could say. Loss of self-esteem in terms of justifying who they always wanted to believe they were versus who they suddenly see they are. What a thing possibly to pull off if we could.